Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. And I'm lucky enough to be joined by a guy who I actually met you on our NAB panel. Jay Nachlis, how you doing?
Good, Andy. Good to see you.
You are let me get the title right, VP and Consultant at Coleman Insights, is that correct?
That's right. I am one of the consultants on the team at Coleman, yep.
And you had a lot of good points on the panel, so I may repeat and ask you a couple of the questions that we talked about on the panel. But before we get into, and I want to pick your brain on data and all kinds of stuff. But before we get into that, I know you got your start. Was it on air? How'd you kind of get into radio?
I got into radio when I was 15 and got an internship when I was in high school, and I wanted to go into sports. I was one of those kids that knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, right? I wanted to be a sports broadcaster, and so I applied to this internship program at KNBR in San Francisco, which is where I grew up, and envisioned myself, working at Candlestick Park, doing this incredible internship with Giants games, And instead, some other guy got the KNBR internship. I ended up getting an internship at a CHR station in San Francisco called X100. It was owned by Emmis at the time. And it ended up just being this incredible blessing because I learned how to be a board op and a producer and worked promotions and all the things, right? And from there, that was where the kind of addiction to music radio came from. And then from there, for most of my career, I was on air, I was a PD, and then moved to Coleman about 7.5 years ago.
And what do you do now with Coleman?
So I work on the client side, doing studies of all kinds of different types, right? Some are quantitative, some are qualitative, and it's not just radio. A lot of my clients are on the radio side, but I also have clients on the podcasting side, which is really exciting too. We've done some work in streaming as well, and even some things in other verticals, but that's our wheelhouse is radio and podcasting for the most part. And so essentially it's the client says, here's my challenges, right? Here's what keeps me up at night. Here's what I really need to learn. I need a roadmap. I need a strategy. And so we'll determine what's the project, what's the type of research methodology that gets the answers to the questions that the client's looking for, conduct the study, do the analysis, make the recommendations, and then create that strategic roadmap for them.
And I like using that as a starting point, as opposed to taking data and trying to fit that into the story. So I think that's smart.
Got to know where you want to go first.
Yeah. What are some of the tools you guys have that can really help radio stations or maybe a particular radio show build its audience, improve performance?
Several different ones. So a couple to focus on. I mean, the number one thing that we do for radio stations, and we use this for shows too, is something called a plan developer. And essentially that's a perceptual study. It's really going out and it's finding a group of radio listeners that we're in a certain demographics, right? That may be in a certain listening universe. And you're really trying to understand on a very deep level, what are my strengths and weaknesses? What are my opportunities to grow? What are the vulnerabilities of the competition that I can exploit? What are the marketing messages that I should be using, right? And it's really getting in under the hood to figure out, do I own my music position? How well known and appealing are my personalities? How well received is my marketing? Do people even know that we exist? It's funny, Andy. One of the number one things that you discover in plan developers that sometimes blows radio people away is when you're only using Nielsen or Eastland or a ratings tool for your measurement, then you're not really because as you know, those are audience estimates, right? And
Sure.
So you're and the sample sizes can be on the lower side. And so you get really frustrated when things happen and your ratings go down and you automatically will blame it on something. When sometimes there's nothing to blame. Sometimes they just got the sample wrong. Sometimes somebody left the panel, right?
Sometimes somebody went on vacation.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Literally.
And sometimes even really good ratings are artificial and will go away. And when you do these types of studies, you're getting really good sample sizes and you're you're going to really determine perceptually whether or not your station or show is healthy or whether or not it isn't healthy. And and that's the real value to determine how to move forward with it. So that's the number one tool that people use. For shows, you mentioned like show research. One of the things that a pretty neat tool for that is something called Media EKG. And that's a content testing tool where essentially you play pieces of content for listeners. They can check it out on their device, their computer, their tablet, their phone, and then second by second they're rating it, moving their mouse or their finger to the left for something they don't like, right,
Yep.
and to the right if they do. Creates a graph, or like what we call an EKG, and then you can really see those peaks and valleys and go, well, here's how the audience reacted when you did this or when you did this, and they reacted well to this, and figure out the why behind it. See the different lines, how it did with total, but also how did it do by age or gender or ethnicity or P1s versus QM and those kinds of things. So those are a couple. There's a lot more. There's music testing. There's focus groups and things like that. But those are two that relate to your question.
Well, and what I really like about the second one is as a talent coach, it really allows you, because sometimes we'll be making the same point to a morning show over and over again, and it's just not really getting through. But when they really see at this point, when you kind of reiterate or you go, a minute further into the content than you should have, this is where they can tell people are dropping off there, and it really hits home to them.
I was with a group of broadcasters this past week in Nashville and had that very discussion. It was a guy who oversees some of the programming at this network, and he used Media EKG for multiple talent on his radio station. So, there's different ways to use it, but literally they were doing different studies. And so in other words, it was like taking 7 or 8 pieces of content from each show. So taking the morning show, taking the afternoon show, right? And really diving into each one. And that's exactly what he said. Was it allowed me to sit down with them, and when they saw it, it's irrefutable.
Right.
This is this now. And in some cases, in most cases, because program directors tend to know what they're talking about, in most cases it backs up the point you're already making. And in other cases, look, sometimes you find things that you didn't expect as the program director too from Media EKG, and that can be valuable as well.
Yeah, but it's so helpful because so much of what we do is kind of a gray area. So when you're coaching talent and trying to manage talent, it's like, well, that's just your perception of it, man. You know what I mean? So this really puts some hard data behind. No, you'll notice how everybody turned their dial to the right, here at roughly the same time. So it really hits home. The other thing you mentioned in there that I really like is the look when the ratings come out, something to blame. And when you're just looking at the audience estimates, and I know there's things you can dive in through PD Advantage and stuff, but what I see quite often is people blaming the wrong thing.
Exactly.
And so some of the supplemental research that you're talking about really helps you get that part right, and that's so critical.
I had a client a few years ago that their ratings were just kept going down, 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 down. And the composition really changed where all of a sudden their audience was so heavily weighted 45-54. It was like the station had aged up. The median age had gone up way too high in a short period of time. And in response, this particular programmer had actually moved his music older in response to the data that he was getting from Nielsen, which is exactly the thing you shouldn't do, because you can't rely on that data for strategy. And so he rightfully did a plan developer. And what we actually discovered was a couple of major points. Like one big point was the station was much healthier perceptually than it was in Nielsen. So I was actually able to say, I know it's hard to hear now, but honestly, based on what we see, give this a few months, let the panel change, and I do think you're going to be in better shape, which they were. But the other point was that this was a station that was seen perceptually as a younger radio station. This was a contemporary radio station, seen as a contemporary station that he had shifted older. So his music strategy was going against the expectation of the consumer. And so that's one of those real danger areas that if he had kept the content that out of sync with perceptions, that's that's a death knell. So we were able to reverse it quick enough.
Yeah, and then you also get the people aging out of that turning 56 or I'm sorry 55
Uh-huh.
and falling out of that, and that's another frustrating thing. I've got some stations that are really strong in the 55 plus, and get left off of a lot of buys because of that, even though their audience is great.
It's it's the same old story, right? It continues to be this huge frustration where the advertising community still wants 25, 54. And you're right, because there's real value in 55 to 64, 55 plus. There is. And
They have
stations,
money.
well, yeah, that have money. Exactly. Well, and it's kind of wild for me. Like sometimes I'll work on some of our European clients. I'll do studies in Europe, and it's always fascinating to me because almost every study in Europe includes up to 64 and sometimes 69, and you never ever see that in the U.S. And I wish it was, but the reason why. You mentioned it. It's advertising.
Well, yeah, but I've got one Tracy Johnson and I built that's the whole point of the format is to not mention it's an oldies format where we never say old. And
Yeah,
so the
smart.
everything's positive and about how great and nostalgic and that era of music is. But we got the first market we put it in, we got a lot of spillover and still had a decent 2554 number, because the music still appeals to a lot of people in their 40s and 50s. So I don't think that that's necessarily a reason to always stay away from those formats.
Well, I agree. I mean, and look at classic rock, which
Yeah.
is now for years had, great appeal with, 25 to 34-year-olds, because they're discovering it. And that music really is evergreen. And so there's always going to be a portion when you've got that kind of music that is so strong and would never go away, it's always going to attract a certain amount of younger
Oh,
consumers.
speaking of classic rock, have you noticed, and you've probably seen this in the data y'all pull, for some reason, Creedence Clearwater Revival has had this huge like young people are just now discovering them for some reason, but their their streaming numbers are through the roof. And no one really knows why. I don't even think they were in a movie, like their songs were in a movie recently. It's just an odd thing. Have y'all noticed that in the data?
No, I haven't caught that.
Okay.
That's really
Maybe
interesting.
that's just a market level thing here in DFW.
Maybe. I mean, sometimes that can be, like you said, though. Sometimes it's a movie, sometimes it's a meme, right? Or it's in a TikTok,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden it blows up. That definitely happens from time to time.
You wrote a great article recently about Stanley. What
Oh,
branding?
yeah, the cups, right?
Yep. What branding lesson can radio learn from that 111-year-old company?
Well, how to evolve. It's funny. That was the original Stanley Cup was this like dark green, right? Big
Ugly. Yeah.
durable thermos, and it was known for, like, construction was a blue collar thing, and construction workers would take it to the site, and they would always have that thing with them, and then it went out of fashion because for obvious reasons, but they figured out a way to make this fashionable, and they put it in these bright colors, and they made it was fascinating. They made it appeal to women. And how could you have ever? It would have been so easy to write off the fact that a brand like that, like, well, no, we should do what we've always done, right? We should lean into what we know. But they were able to realize that there was a need for that type of product if they branded it the right way. The product was always, like, the content was always good. It was always a great product.
Sure. It
But
lasts forever.
it lasts forever. But you had to figure out how to brand it properly to a new consumer, and they did that. I mean, I remember some of the social media content around the time where they really surged, and these women are, like, lining up at Starbucks to get
Yeah.
this limited edition Stanley Cup. It was just the most amazing thing, and they effectively used social media. They effectively used video, and it just became a viral sensation from that. And of course, there's no guarantee that you can do that, but I think the lesson for radio is is what I said before, which is don't think about your brand the way you've always thought about your brand. How can you expand to a new consumer with what you're really good at? Because there's always, there's never not a desire for engagement and content and great personalities and all the things and localism, all the things radio's really good at. But we have to recognize that marketing it the same way or not marketing it at all, is not the answer, right? And I do think, and something I run into a lot is I think that radio too often, when they do marketing, or they think that paid marketing is the only type of marketing, right? Or then they think it's billboards, it's linear television. Like, there are so many tools at our disposal now, both organic and paid, that I think radio doesn't take nearly enough advantage of.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we always look at TV, billboards, the traditional ways we've always done it. But one of the things that helps a ton on the social side, and this is if they're creating content that works well on social media, like being willing to put some money behind that, because there you can see, like, hey, this is already getting traction. So having a budget to put some money behind that stuff. I mean, that's what Stanley did essentially. That was almost all that all happened on social, right? First.
Yeah, the vast majority of it happened on social. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, and you, it's obviously these social media platforms have made it harder and harder to grow organically. If you're a business, I mean, certainly Facebook has.
Yeah.
They're not the only ones. And yeah, you can get lucky on TikTok and Reels and some of these other ones, but the reality is that they do offer opportunities for paid content. You're right. And I don't think that gets explored by radio enough.
Well, and it's especially hard. Like, I've worked with stations that are heritage stations that built up their social stats before, because before they started charging for all the boosted posts and sponsored posts, that a larger percentage of your fans saw your content. Once they changed the algorithm once they started charging for it. So for a brand new station to go up against a heritage station that already has 100,000 plus social followers without putting any budget behind boosting any of that stuff, it's really tough.
Yeah, and thinking about the way radio stations market themselves in general, I think there needs to be a whole rethink about it. That's what we're talking about for social media is one part of it, but think about the average radio station website that you see that looks like somebody threw up on the screen. Sometimes the content on radio station websites is you can't even see the station brand. And you can't find the personalities. They're buried somewhere.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a shame. I mean, we need to make sure that our radio station websites are truly engaging and sell the value of what we do. Easy to find out about the things that are our strengths, and I think it goes to the apps, it goes to the website, it goes to social media. And it goes to using our own databases, which is something that we can think about a lot as well. Like, if we're only using our databases, for example, to send out messages about concert tickets we're giving away, that's a missed opportunity too.
Yeah, but it all comes back to content. I mean, if you're not, yes, I think radio station websites are for the most part pretty rough. And we work with I've got a graphic designer on staff, and we work with stations on that. And you're right, the things will be buried. The website will look like it was created in 1995. And a lot of those things, but it really comes back to the thing I always remind people is this is the digital platform that you 100% own and control.
Yeah. Right.
The social stuff can change out from under you. You don't control that, but you 100% control your website. So that's a platform that you really want to turn into your storefront to showcase the best of what you got.
Well, it's like the old, what they always tell you in outdoor advertising, right? Is don't put too much on the billboard. because you want people. It's partially the law of focus. You don't want too much in your messaging for people to ingest, but also there's only so much time. So capture them with the messages that you want to get. And if you're putting too much on there, it's just going to get lost.
Yeah, and for the love of God, don't put 15 freaking ads on. Like the ad to content ratio is another thing we always harp on,
Right.
where it's just like, looks like a NASCAR. And come on, man. I mean,
I know. And that's what I was trying to get at. And sometimes I know that local radio stations don't have control. Depends, sometimes that comes from corporate. If it's a big company, for sure, there's more control if you have a local station that's not in a big chain like that. So it's tough. Sometimes you're given what you're given, and sometimes, you're able to control it. But if you're able to control it, do what you can.
and I know that, so now you're working with podcasters, and are you a believer that radio needs to be getting more into podcasting and more into video content, or where do you kind of land on that?
I do, and I think that there are some really great success stories too in radio that have successfully moved into podcasting and are actually making some real revenue. I mean, like one example is the KVJ show at WRMF in West Palm Beach.
Mm-hmm.
They do their own like podcast. It's a whole separate. It's not a retread or recycle of the show itself. It's a separate show that they do, specific content. It's a little filthy compared to they can get away with stuff right on the podcast. They don't get away with on air, but it's still within their brand because they're a little bit edgy, but not crazy edgy. And this thing is hugely successful. They do events. They got good listenership. They sell it. And I think that there's a path for radio to understand, like take your really key, valuable personalities. And it's tough. And when I say this, I totally recognize this is like I think we were talking up top or before we turned the camera on about like, this is just another thing, right? To give your talent to do. Oh, you want me to do another podcast? Oh, you want me to film it? I get that, right? But at the same time, it builds your personal brand. It builds the station brand. It's an extra source of revenue. Like there's all kinds of benefits to it. So sure, at the very least, stations should be offering and I think most of them are offering their audio from the show on there. But I think that there's real opportunities to expand your brand as long as you keep it within the framework of something that's like not completely out there that the audience doesn't expect, but something that accentuates your brand. I think it could be really valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that show because I have some folks on staff that we had combing through to try to find good digital content from stations, and that's one of the first ones they brought me was that KVJ show out of West Palm Beach, isn't that right?
West Palm Beach, yeah, they're really good.
Yeah, they do some really good stuff. But I like you said, I totally get it because I don't like coming to work like it's picture day every day either. One of the things we like about radio is that you don't have to, make sure your hair is perfect every day and you're video or picture friendly every day. But there's just too many benefits of it, in my opinion, to continue avoiding it, especially on the social side, because the video works so much better on social.
I was about to bring that very thing up. Like at the very least, and look, there's still a decent percentage of people that listen to podcasts audio only. Right now, there are a good percentage of people that are listening. It's funny. You forget about this, but there's a fair amount of people that use video, like they're using YouTube, for example, for podcasts, but they're actually only listening to the audio.
Right.
But that's the app that you use. But that's another reason why video is valuable. But if you said to me, Jay, look, it's just too much for me to do a video version of the podcast every day, and so I can only do audio, I would say fine. At the very least, do audio. And there are also, the other thing to add to that is there are certain types of podcasts that are not as conducive to video, like for full episodes, right? Like you may not want to do a narrative podcast in the same way that we're doing it now, or a fiction podcast, like sports for sure. But it depends what we're doing. That all said, back to something you said, which is every single podcast though needs to be doing video in some form for marketing. As a
Right.
marketing tool, as a discovery tool, it's incredible. And then, I mean, the AI tools, like we talked about, uh, are available for you to make short form content and use YouTube Shorts, Reels, TikTok, make these teaser content. At the very least, even if your podcast itself is audio only, I definitely think you should be using it for that.
Yeah, and I think that's where not everyone's aware of. I mean, it's essentially like having a staff, like having an editing staff now. All those AI tools, because I don't think folks that have been resistant to get into it realize how easy it is to use some of those AI tools to create those reels for you I mean, within a couple minutes. And you can even use it to full on edit a whole podcast for you now too. I mean, it's insane how far this technology's gotten in just a short amount of time.
Yeah, you can. I mean, even if your podcast is audio only, you could take some of the best of, it could identify, right, certain clips from that episode or certain themes. You can look for certain words, right, that stuff that you want to get across. And then it will make that video for you, just using, different pieces of animation that, that put the audio under without having to have a video podcast for sure.
Well, and it's insane how it learns you, like, because I'm from Texas and I got a little bit of a Southern accent that gets worse if I'm not paying attention to it. And so when I first started using the AI tools, it got a lot of stuff wrong on the transcript,
Yes.
and now it gets it almost all right because it's learned my voice and the speech patterns and stuff. I mean, it's crazy how good all that stuff is.
Yep. And it's just the beginning.
Yeah. On the music data side, how big of a role do streaming numbers play in your process at Coleman?
So, well, so for typical music testing, when somebody is testing their, I mean, for library testing, typically you're not looking at a lot of streaming data, but
Mhm.
for new music research
Absolutely.
for call research, you're definitely looking at it. I think you have to look at it. So, we have a lot of clients. So Integrate is our call out division. It's that's our product is called Integrate. And so we have stations that use local Integrate, so they do their own call out data. And then there are some that use our national product, which is called Integrate USA. So for Integrate USA, it's kind of it's an interest. The process that we go through is kind of interesting because we meet and we have our own music meeting inside Coleman, and we're determining which songs that we want to test each week, and we're going through and we're looking at data that we've gotten from Luminate, so that we're looking at chart numbers, we're looking at and we're looking at streaming numbers, and essentially streaming becomes I think for us in many respects like a tiebreaker or a way to identify something that you might want to get on earlier than normal. Like generally when you're talking about new music research, you don't want to test it too early because it's going to be too unfamiliar
Sure.
and it's going to give you poor results off the bat. But streaming can really give you sometimes it allows you to identify something that's going to be this big story that's probably going to go on a faster incline. Sabrina Carpenter, right? Chapel Roan, like these things that come up that just massively hit, and you go, okay, well maybe we could put this in the second week out rather than waiting for a few more weeks after that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, that's the main reason we look at it on our side is to see the brand new stuff because it, like you said, it's getting traction before you have time to do the call out research and before it has time to become familiar. But you can see, hey, something's working with this one because it's clearly connecting with the audience.
Yeah, but it's important to remember how not to use streaming. And the way not to use streaming is to make a music decision for your radio station just because it has a big streaming story. Because there's all kinds of things that could be going on behind the scenes, right? The thing about streaming is that initially, when something drops, those numbers tend to really be affected by the super fans of that artist.
Yeah.
Right? So you see this big inflation up in the beginning, and then over time, that's when the rubber really hits the road, and you see over time, is it going to drop like a lead balloon, or does it have more of of a layered, and then actually when something ends up having a mass appeal, you start to actually see it go back up, right?
Sure.
And then also keeping in mind sometimes things like, well, you go, well, why did that song have higher streaming numbers than the others? Because it's the first track on the album. It's the ones that people opened first, right?
Yeah.
So that's and another point about streaming is that streaming is only showing you the positives. We don't know who doesn't like a song. We only see the people that are listening to it that like it.
Oh,
But
yeah, that's a good point.
but in radio, we're a mass appeal medium. And so negatives are important to us. So that's where call out research is so valuable as that supplemental tool, because call out's going to show you who's passionate about it, but it's also going to show you who doesn't like it. And streaming doesn't show you who doesn't like it. There can be huge streaming songs that are wildly polarizing that aren't good for radio.
Yeah, and the point you made in there that about coming out of the gate strong, because if an artist has incredibly high social stats, every song they put out is going to have that a pretty decent first week on streaming.
Yeah.
But it's whether it sustains that really tells you, you know. So can it hold that number and increase that number weeks in, or is that just because they shared it on social and everybody went and clicked on that? You know.
Yeah, all important things to consider.
Yep. I asked you this on the panel, and you had a good answer, but audience, and this kind of ties back into what you were talking about earlier with Nielsen and Eastland, but audience estimates are one thing, but how do we answer the why questions, like why someone tunes into a radio station or a show? Why do you turn it off? Why do you stop listening? Why do they listen to some parts of the show and not others? Do you have some tools that help with that?
Yeah, so that's the qualitative research side of the equation, right? So we talk about quantitative research, which is the what in research, and qualitative research is the why. So we talked earlier about a plan developer. That's quantitative research. That's understanding what people think about your radio station, right? What do they think about your personalities? What do they think about your music position, your images, etc.? Qualitative answers the why. And so to get at questions like that, that's where we would use things like a focus group. We actually launched during the pandemic when we couldn't do in-person focus groups. We launched something called Campfire, which is an online discussion group platform. It looks like a social media platform, and it essentially allows people to participate in the focus group experience from comfort of their own home or wherever they are, and not have to go into some room with the separated glass that at 7 o'clock at night where they get some bad food. Those in-person focus groups are still, and that's not to diminish the value of those. They still have a lot of value for sure. But sometimes Campfire is a great way to go. It can be cost effective. It's, like I said, it's very convenient, allows you to reach more people that may not want to do an in-person focus group. And then there's lots of different things that you can't do in person. For example, you can, some of these you can, but it's much easier. So you could play pieces of video, you could play pieces of audio, you can show, you could play a commercial, you could test marketing messages, you can do polls. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get at the why for people. And just like in an in-person focus group, things will come up that you didn't even expect, and then you can probe those more deeply. So the only difference there between an in-person focus group and an online focus group is in person, it's all real time right away. In a Campfire online, it's not always real time, but it's still like if you have a thread and we have a moderator constantly in there looking at stuff, and somebody, answers a question about a show. Well, what do you think about this personality when they do this? And somebody answers it, and then a thread comes down, and the next person comments, oh yeah, I noticed that too, and I also noticed this. And then the moderator comes in, and then they probe that deeply. So it has a lot of the same types of effects. It's just not structured exactly the same way, but you get a lot of the same results.
Well, I like that because, everyone I know that's been a part of a focus group, that's seen the back end of it, or paid for focus groups and gotten to see that day, loves them But the rub is, and the challenge is like the cost. It's expensive to do a focus group, and
Yeah.
so sometimes radio shies away from that. So that might be for people that don't feel like they could afford to do those in-person focus groups. That might be a good option.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can tell you that the clients that have used Campfire tend to be very, very pleased with it. It's pretty neat.
If you could travel back in time to when you first started programming and hand your younger self one piece of data that's available today, what would that be?
Uh, oh gosh, that's a great question. Um, if I could hand myself one piece of data, oh well, it would be unaided awareness, because I think that. So let me talk for a second about. There's a philosophy at Coleman we talk about a lot, and that is outside thinking, and that's this principle that not just radio people, any business, you can't help but think like that people that are consuming your product consume it like you do. But as you know, Andy, we consume radio a ridiculous amount compared to the average listener, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And so we have deep impressions of the personalities and our music images and our contesting, and we just think that the average listener gets it. But all you have to do is go to a remote and be brought down to earth pretty quickly when most people don't even know who the personality is, right?
Yeah.
And or haven't heard of the radio station. And so outside thinking is recognizing that the average listener is very busy. Your radio station or podcast is a very small portion of their day in their universe, and they just don't care that much about you the way that you think they do. And so unaided awareness is important, because in the beginning of every plan developer, we simply ask which radio stations or podcasts or whatever we're talking about can you think of, whether or not you listen to them. So this is a great measurement of just top of mind awareness. What brands are sticky in people's minds? And what you learn from that, unaided, not aided, right? Not putting a drop down box in front of them.
Yeah,
but
they haven't seen the logo. Yeah.
Yeah. You recognize that not that many people, relative to what you think, are even aware on a top of mind basis that your station exists. And when you look at those studies, what you find time after time is that unaided awareness correlates to cume. So the stations that have higher levels of unaided awareness are generally the ones that have the highest level of listening. And then sometimes when stations and PDs beat themselves up and say, well, why aren't my numbers higher? Why is my cume so low? It's simply because not enough people are thinking about you, that you've got a top of mind problem.
Right.
And that's a principle that unaided awareness, that if I'd gone back to my younger self, that's something that I would have paid more attention to really learn and recognize that that's the figure, that's the simple measurement that you have to build before anything.
And I like that you said outside thinking. The way I always put it, and I kind of like your way better, is think like a listener, is what I always tell them. Because the other thing, you've heard it 1,000 times, but the on-air talent complaining about how often a song's playing. And you have
Right.
to remind them, yeah, we listen considerably more than your average listener. So yes, you're going to get worn out on songs before the listener does. But it's very hard because we're so close to it, for us to put ourselves in the mindset of the listener. And that's where focus groups and outside research helps a ton.
Yes, it's funny. I don't put a lot of stock into. We measure burn in our music tests. You ask people if they're very tired of a song, but I always tell clients to take that with a grain of salt. But the reality is, burn levels are rarely a big problem. They just
Right.
they're rarely an issue, and which goes back to the point you were just making. Like, yeah, radio people get burned on songs very heavily because we hear it over and over again. People just generally don't. I mean, I did a study for a regional Mexican station recently, and it's a station that has a huge playlist, and they think that their listeners are getting tired of songs. The average burn on their library is 4%.
Oh, wow.
4. Imagine that. 4% very tired. So that's essentially no burn. Like nobody's tired of anything.
Yeah, yeah.
And so play, it goes back to the same principle. Play the hits, play them often, and you don't need to have, particularly if you're in a contemporary format. It's different for format. Obviously, gold-based formats can have higher libraries, but this whole thing about worrying about whether or not listeners get tired of a song, no, they want to hear songs they like.
I
Period.
call it the allure of the massive database or the bigger database. It just there's something about it that draws programmers. I mean, we all kind of want to program a station that has a one of those bigger databases so we can get and it's just market after market. You see the guys that are identifying the most popular tunes and hitting them often tend to win. Across the board.
That's the common misperception of the word variety. Variety is not how big your playlist is. Variety, the way listeners define variety, is often by texture. So, if, for example, I've got a classic rock station, variety to them isn't that you're playing 1,000 songs, it's that you're playing AC/DC next to, Bob Seger. One
Yeah.
is hard classic rock, right? And the other one is a more, mainstream sound. And you might play, and then you might play the Eagles, which comes from the classic hits side.
Yeah.
That's variety to the listener. It's not crazy deep playlists.
Yeah, and so that's where coding is more important than the size of your
Exactly.
database, really.
Exactly.
So one thing I've noticed, so on Radio Update, we have available radio gigs. We have job postings on there,
Hmm.
and when we launched that, and I started seeing a lot more data and analytics positions, especially recently, and those jobs tend to pay well. And I'm talking about radio gigs. Any
Hmm.
advice for radio people looking to up their data and analytics skills to maybe contend for one of those jobs?
I would just say learn as much as you can. Is really the biggest thing. I found when I was coming up in radio, and even now, and I've been in radio a long time. I will just reach out to people to soak up and learn as much as I can. So, like for me, when I was a very young program director, I was fortunate because I was exposed to research early on. I was with a company called New City, which ended up getting sold to Cox, but they invested in research all the time. And I, after the study, would sit there with the person who was doing the presentation, and I would just ask questions about it. Tell me about how you do your music testing. Tell me about the methodology behind these perceptual studies. Like I just had this intrinsic curiosity about how it was all done. And then, before I got this gig, it was, same thing. I was an end user of research, but I wanted to know more about how it was actually done and how it was conducted. So I just think for me, most people on my side of the house, my people that are on the research side, I think are more than willing to talk with anybody that was interested in it. So that would be my advice: is find some key people, and there are a lot of great people that do this kind of work, and just reach out and ask questions and learn.
Yeah, and especially on there's so many terms that I find it's best to just admit it. I don't know what that word means. Tell me what that word means, and not to mention like the thing you said about being inquisitive. It also makes you more comfortable if you're the end user. It makes you more comfortable with making decisions based on that data because you kind of get to see how the sausage is made a little bit.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, most research companies, we will do a lot of custom research that, and when you're doing mostly custom research, that's data that you can't release publicly because it's, the client is buying it. That's specifically for them, right?
Right.
But then there's other studies that you release for the industry or you release nationally. So we've done plenty of those studies as well. There's many of them on our website. There's one that we did that I conducted for podcasting, right, about video podcasting, and that's studies on the website, and we did webinars for it, and you can find the report, and that's all good stuff to go and find too. I think any studies that you can that are public facing that you can go out and read, or watch webinars, and that will give you a good a good insight to it as well.
Last question, because I know I'm keeping you long, but and this is, we can cut this if it's not an easy question to answer, but what will the radio industry look like in 5 years?
The old 5-year question. Here's the thing. I would be really full of myself if I answered that question with a definitive answer, because the reality is I don't think any of us really know.
Yeah.
I think there are some obvious places that the radio industry is going to go. There's no doubt that AI is going to be more a part of our industry, but how much of a part it is, I don't really know. But I do think that the stations that are most successful are the ones that are intensely focused on their local communities, and effectively, determine what it is that they want and continue to entertain them and engage them and have deep relationships with their listeners. The ones that don't, that are a little more disposable, they're the ones that are gonna struggle.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, that's why I always say don't use AI as an excuse to fire your staff. Teach your staff to embrace AI, and so it seems like there's a lot larger staff than there actually is. I think that's part of the key.
I mean, look, I do have an optimistic view of all of that, and I hope I'm right. But because, not to say that, I mean, look, AI is, some of the stuff that's being done right now is unbelievable. The stuff that 11 Labs has put out and the stuff that they're getting now
sounds pretty real.
It's incredible, and they're getting context and they're getting accents, and
they can land a joke if you get the punctuation right.
Right. And so, but at the same time, I do believe that, although there will be plenty of uses for that, I think that ultimately, the best personalities are going to be the ones that have that ability. It's engagement. It's the ability to engage. You can have a great sounding break that's artificial, but I don't know if the level of engagement and emotion will ever be able to be quite matched the same. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's why it's so important. If you do have a local on-air shift, that you're engaging in every way you can and interacting with the listeners, and working those phones and doing those things we did back in the day that people seem to have gotten away from a little bit, because that's all the stuff that AI will never be able to do.
Yeah, there's, when we do research studies, you see the stations that are most successful, their listeners have really deep feelings about those radio stations. None of the ones that are hugely successful, they're generally not successful by accident. Do you know what I mean? And they're not shallow. They're not, these are stations that listeners, they care deeply about that station and what it means to them, and what the personalities, the role that they play in their day, like all of that stuff. And there's brands that have been around a long time that you would think would be tailing off at this point, but because they continue to invest and coach and care about their listeners and research and all that, are still doing very, very well. And it's always very refreshing for us to continue to see that.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Did we get out there how they can reach you and find you guys?
Our website is ColemanInsights.com, and you can find all the members of the team, including me, on there. We also put out a blog every other week called Tuesdays with Coleman, and
good stuff on there too.
Thank you. Yeah, and so if you go onto the blog section of ColemanInsights.com too, you can find the button to subscribe to that blog. It's a great way to get some marketing research and just kind of trends and things that are going on as well. Which, back to your question about if if it's a business that you're interested in, that's a good way to find out a lot about what's going on there as well.
Yeah, and see some of the, like you said, some of that public-facing data that you guys have done.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Andy. I enjoyed it.
Radio Influencers is a radio update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.